Greetings, class. Greetings, Dr. O. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me this evening. This evening, I'll be talking about the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction. And what I'm going to start off with is a short conversation about the birds and the bees. When we talk about sexual reproduction, really what that means is when a male and a female individual of a specific species come together to procreate. They combine one half of the DNA from the father, one half of the DNA from the mother, and this process results in the creation of a new life. When we talk about asexual reproduction, on the other hand, we're talking about an entire population of females. The reproduction process takes place with a single female that's effectively cloning herself, creating a new organism with identical DNA. But the result is the same. It is also the creation of a new life. So to frame the discussion specifically about the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction, I've chosen two animals to talk about. We're going to look at the crocodile and the Tasmanian devil. But first, we're going to talk about the overarching advantages of sexual reproduction. And so the one that jumps out at me immediately is evolutionary success. And so over time, everywhere we look in all the ecosystems around the world, not just now, but for time immemorial, sexual reproduction is more successful. The majority of organisms are using sexual reproduction to reproduce. Obviously, this must then impart some advantage. We know it imparts an advantage because it's more common. And it's the one that's used the most. Therefore, it's the best one. The second advantage that sexual reproduction gives is variation. And so when you get half DNA from the father and half DNA from the mother, you get DNA combinations that otherwise wouldn't exist. Some of those new combinations create mutations, but they really are adaptations that impart advantages to the offspring. Because those offspring have that advantage, they're more capable to reproduce and carry those adaptations on through the species. Through the line, through their line of children, effectively. The next one I'll talk about is a little more subtle, maybe not as scientific as some of the other ones, but when we look at the will to live and you look at animals trying to survive, or really anything trying to survive in the wild, that will to pass on your DNA, pass on their DNA, reproduce, gives them that will to fight through situations they might otherwise not really strive to. And so I kind of define that as the will to live, and it maybe imparts that extra little bit of advantage to fight to stay alive, just that extra little bit that makes all the difference. When we look at coevolution, we always talk about the relationships between predator and prey, where the prey evolve and adapt and become harder to catch, and then the predators evolve and become more efficient at making kills. And that pendulum swings continually back and forth. Really, that improves the genetic stock of all of the organisms participating in that ecosystem. So we'd say that rising tide is raising all boats. The next one is choice. Pretty simple here. You have a choice who you mate with. You can choose based on the advantages that mate might impart to your children. And you may not choose another mate for the exact opposite reason, and so things will get selected out. And so that's a huge advantage, that active cognitive ability to select or not select in the moment. And then finally, there's been quite a few scientific studies that prove that the sexual reproduction process enables the genome to clean itself out and prevent harmful mutations from carrying on through the line. When we talk about specific advantages for the crocodile, first, a little bit about the crocodile. They've existed roughly in their current form for about 85 million years. They reside in 5 continents on the planet and are clearly extremely well adapted to all the environments from which they hail. Specific advantages that I was able to see in sexual reproduction for the crocodile: they have a high level of disease resistance. They've been under that process of natural selection for such a long time. that the genes are really tuned to fight off disease. Funnily enough, it's actually quite a rapidly evolving organism. The old adage is that the crocodile hasn't changed since the time of the dinosaurs and 250 million years and all that. But what's really happening is, they're evolving away from and back to the forms that we see today. And really they're actually converging, because they're evolving separately, all the very various species of crocodile, they're converging on the most efficient form. They've had that 85 million years. They've had the advantage of sexual reproduction. And so they're landing on the right teeth, the right skull shape, the right camouflage, the right body shape. Not because they're not evolving, but because they're all evolving towards a perfect state. And then the last advantage is survival of the fittest. The mating ritual for the crocodile is pretty harsh. In most species, generally the big male dominates an area, dominates the access to the females, and so it makes it really difficult for other males to get in there and mate. So the ones that do obviously impart some advantage to their offspring. Maybe they're a little more clever, maybe they're a little faster, whatever it is, because it's so difficult for them to get those genes into the gene pool. Only the best make it. Now we're going to talk a bit about the sexual reproduction disadvantages. And so the image here of the half-flowering tree really raises to my mind the biggest disadvantage of sexual reproduction, which is that half the population have no offspring. So only the females can have offspring, none of the males can, and so that results in a slower reproducing population. A lot of energy is also required to find a mate, take place in the act of mating, potentially look after offspring. This all requires quite a lot of energy. It also requires a healthy mate. We're going to talk a little bit about the challenges that some of these organisms face when they can't find a mate because of genetic bottlenecks, etc. And the last one is an interesting one. You get those examples of that perfect individual that's just perfectly adapted to his or her environment, absolutely dominating. And so in the asexual process, that would be a perfect copy of that stellar individual. But when we talk about sexual reproduction, only half those genes get passed on. So you're not guaranteed that all of those traits that made that individual so successful are going to get passed along. When we look at the Tasmanian Devil, we all know that any species facing a genetic bottleneck is really up against it in terms of their survival. The Tasmanian Devil is facing a double-edged sword specific to sexual reproduction because their violent mating ritual has led to the spread of a contagious cancer called devil facial tumor disease. And in some ways, the irony is the reason why they're so susceptible in the first place is because they were already facing a limited genetic pool. In that scenario, when one individual is susceptible to a disease, generally the vast majority of individuals in the species, in the population, are also going to be susceptible. And so it's a huge challenge to the survival of the devil. The other challenge that they're facing is the immune animals can't find mates, or they might not know the mate is, their mate is immune or not. I mean, how would you know if you're a devil? You might be immune to the devil facial tumor disease. You have no idea if the devil you're mating with is or isn't. And so it's really another big disadvantage for the devil when we talk about sexual reproduction. Nonetheless, despite all those disadvantages, in my opinion, sexual reproduction always wins out. The scenario we talked about today, when we're looking at a genetic bottleneck, has resulted because everything else was also stacked against that species: hunting, disease, habitat loss, climate change. And so I can't see how even an asexual reproducing organism that was faced with all those four challenges, no matter how they reproduce, would have a better chance of surviving. And so in a vacuum, sexual reproduction always wins out, all things being equal. Some questions I want to leave you with, class. Can you think of any other organisms that benefit from sexual reproduction? I'm sure you can. This is my favorite question. Is there an organism that does not produce sexually or asexually? And I'll give you a little hint. Think about what's going on with the COVID situation these days. That might lead you down the right path. And the final question I have is one I actually do not know the answer to. Has there ever been an organism to switch from one or the other, from asexual to sexual or vice versa? I don't know. Maybe you do. Let me know the answer. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening to me tonight. I look forward to speaking with you again.